The rain came down in sheets over what used to be called Manhattan, and Detective Sergeant Cale Brecht stood in the doorway of a Gud bodega on the corner of what the Votharak occupation maps had relabeled Sector 19, smoking the last quarter-inch of a cigarette he'd been nursing for 2 days. His left arm wasn't his. Hadn't been for 3 years. He didn't think about it much anymore, the way you stop thinking about a scar after enough seasons pass. The fingers of the prosthetic curled around the cigarette with a precision that felt almost offensive, the synthetic joints reading temperature and air resistance and adjusting grip accordingly. The rest of him, the right arm, both legs, the stubborn meat of his chest and skull, was entirely human, entirely breakable. The facility was 6 blocks north. He'd been watching it for 11 hours. He lit a second cigarette from the coal of the first, which was a thing his partner Lena used to call dramatic and unnecessary, and which he still did every time because she wasn't around anymore to give him grief about it. And that was the closest he allowed himself to thinking about her. The Nexus 7 research installation had been human-built, human-staffed, tucked into the basement floors of what had been a federal building before the occupation. The Voth-Arak had let it run. That was the thing about them. They didn't destroy what they could exploit. They had a word for it that the translators rendered roughly as leaving the cow alive. The facility studied Votharak biology, Votharak communication tech, the strange resonance frequencies their neural clusters emitted when they were distressed. Officially, it was a scientific exchange program. Unofficially, it was the last serious intelligence operation humanity had running inside the occupied zone, and 3 nights ago, someone had hit it. Not bombed it, not raided it, hacked it, clean and cold, and walked off with 11 months of data, and every human researcher who'd been inside at the time was now either dead or missing. Cale dropped the second cigarette into a puddle. He picked up his bag and walked north. The streets were not empty, exactly, but they had the hollow quality of a place where people had learned not to make themselves visible. Human figures moved in the peripheral dark. A woman pulling a cart, 2 teenagers in mismatched rain gear, an old man sitting under an awning with an expression of absolute temporal displacement, as though he'd simply decided to remain in 2031 and was waiting for the rest of the world to come back. Cale nodded to the old man as he passed. The old man didn't nod back. That was fine. That was normal. The Voth-Arak patrol unit was at the corner of what used to be 48th and Lex. 2 of them, the stocky, asymmetric shapes of their carapaces gleaming in the wet, the neural sight organs on their forward-facing crowns sweeping lazy arcs through the rain. They were bored. Cale had learned to read their body language over 3 years of this work. The way the forward joint limbs drooped slightly when they were running on low attention cycles. The way the carapace plating made a faint rattle when they were cold. He walked past them on the opposite side of the street, his prosthetic arm tucked inside his coat, his pace unhurried, his posture calibrated to the specific geometry of a man who has nowhere interesting to be. One of them tracked him for 4 seconds, then it looked away. He exhaled. The facility's public entrance, the entrance the Voth-Arak knew about, was a nondescript door set into the building's ground floor, watched by a camera cluster and a pressure sensor array. Cale didn't go there. He went around the building's east face, down a maintenance ramp, through a door that had been welded shut 3 years ago and unwelded 14 months ago by a woman named Doctor, Oren Sethi, who had left a very specific tool mark on the lower hinge as a signature. The door opened on the second tug, the way a door opens when someone's been through it recently, when the hinges still have the memory of motion in them. Inside smelled like burnt circuitry and something organic underneath that he didn't want to name. Cale stood in the dark for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, the prosthetic hand running a passive scan of the electromagnetic environment. The arm had been given to him by a resistance tech named Foss, who had assembled it from 4 different donor limbs and a Voth-Arak sensory array stripped out of a downed scout vehicle, and it was illegal in at least 6 of the 12 senses that the word meant anything anymore. And Cale sometimes thought that it was the most useful thing he'd ever been given, and sometimes thought it was the most terrifying. It reported back now, 2 active devices on the floor above, Voth-Arak in origin, low-power scanning mode, not alerted, not looking, he moved. The facility's lower level was a grid of laboratories and server rooms, and it took him 20 minutes to find the server that had been accessed. Not because the evidence was subtle, but because someone had been careful about the cover, and carefulness takes a long time to see through. What gave it away was not the data trace, not the access log, not any of the obvious things. What gave it away was a coffee cup. Cale stood in the doorway of server room C and looked at the coffee cup sitting on the floor beside the main access terminal and understood that it had been placed there deliberately. Someone had been here long enough to need coffee. Someone had been comfortable enough to sit. Whoever had done this hadn't been rushing. They'd been settling in, working methodically, taking their time. That said something specific about who they were and what they had access to, and what it said made the back of Cale's neck go cold. He photographed the room. He photographed the cup. He ran the prosthetic scan array over the terminals and got a resonance signature that he recorded and would analyze later. Then he went up. The second level had been the researcher's workspace. 8 individual stations, glass-walled collaboration pods, a long table at the center of the room with the kind of organized chaos that meant people had been working there in rotation over shifts for a long time. It looked like 3 stations had been recently cleared, not ransacked. Cleared, the difference mattered. Ransacking is violence. Clearing is intention. Someone had gone to specific stations and taken specific things, and the things they'd taken were not random. Cale pulled up a chair, sat down, and thought. He had a habit, when a case went sideways, of taking out his notebook, an actual paper notebook, which Lena had found ridiculous and which he maintained precisely because it was ridiculous, because things that were ridiculous kept you sane, and writing down what he knew in plain language, the way you'd explain it to someone who didn't know anything. He did this now. He wrote, "Someone with facility access, comfortable, taking time, targeted, knows what they're looking for." He underlined knows what they're looking for twice, because the data that had been taken, he'd been briefed on this 3 days ago, in a parking garage by a woman named Director Vasht, who wore sunglasses indoors and had the specific exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept since before the occupation, was the biological resonance data. The mapping of Voth-Erik neural clusters under stress conditions. 11 months of it. The kind of data that took years to gather, that required proximity, that required the Voth-Erik to not know they were being studied, because the moment they knew, the resonance patterns changed. The question was, who wanted it badly enough to burn the whole facility to get it? The Voth-Erik themselves were the obvious answer, which meant they were almost certainly wrong. The Voth-Erik didn't need to steal their own biology. They were methodical, patient, long-memory creatures who planned in multi-generational arcs. If they'd suspected the research program, they'd have dismantled it slowly, from the outside, the way you drain a lake by redirecting the inflow. They wouldn't break in and steal files like a teenager at a locker. No. Cale sat back and looked at the ceiling and let the thought come. Someone else wanted that data. Someone who knew what it meant. Someone who knew what you could do with a complete neural stress resonance map of the species currently occupying your planet. He was standing up before he consciously decided to. He needed to find Dr. Oren Sathe. She was not in the missing persons list he'd checked. She was not in the casualty report. She had simply not been at the facility the night it was hit, which was either extraordinary luck or extraordinary planning, and the tool mark on the lower hinge of the maintenance door was her signature, her specific signature, and she had been through that door recently enough for the hinges to remember. The trail out of the facility went east and then north. Cale followed it not through surveillance. Most of the cameras in Sector 19 were either dead or feeding false data loops to Voth-Erik monitoring posts, but through the older, slower method of asking people. A teenager at a food distribution point. A woman running a black market pharmacy out of a converted apartment on 52nd. An old man, different from the one under the awning, sitting outside a building that had been a library and was now a library again in the informal sense, stuffed with physical books that people had gathered and categorized and lent to each other, because some things humans did could not be occupied away. The old man had seen a woman matching Oren Sathe's description go into the building behind him 2 nights ago and not come out. Cale thanked him. The old man nodded, this one, unlike the last. The building's lobby was dark and smelled like old paper and the specific cold of a place where heat had been rationed for years. Cale moved through it carefully, the prosthetic arm running constant scans, reporting back. 1 heat signature, upper floor, stationary, not Voth-Erik. He climbed 2 flights and found her in a room full of books, sitting on the floor with her back against a shelf, a small device in her lap that she'd been working on, and had very quickly stopped working on when she heard him on the stairs. She was pointing a weapon at him. Easy, he said. I don't know you. Cale Brecht. Detective Sergeant, Resistance Intelligence, Sector 19 Division. He showed her his credentials, which were a piece of laminated card with a photograph of him looking younger and less tired. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here because you left a tool mark on a hinge. A long pause. I do that on purpose, she said. I know. That's why I'm here. She lowered the weapon slowly, with the specific reluctance of someone who's been scared for a long time and finds it hard to stop. She was somewhere in her 50s, fine-boned, with the hollowed look of someone who'd been living below maintenance caloric intake. And her hands, when she set the device aside, were steady in the way that only happens when you've trained yourself past the shaking. Cale recognized this quality. He had it himself. He thought of Lena again and pushed her back down. You know what they took, he said. It wasn't a question. I took it, she said. The room went very quiet. Walk me through it, he said. He sat down on the floor across from her, which was a choice. It made him lower than her, less threatening, and it was also just how his legs felt right now after 11 hours of surveillance and 6 flights of stairs total. All of it. Dr. Oren Sethe took a breath and told him. She'd been running the neural resonance program for 3 years. She'd built it from scratch, designed the measurement protocols, figured out that the resonance patterns of Vothorak neural clusters under specific stress conditions were as individual as fingerprints, specific to individual Vothorak and to specific types of stress. Fear, confusion, pain. The resonance for each was distinct, and she'd mapped them, and she'd done it because the Resistance's intelligence arm had asked her to, and for the first 2 years she'd believed it was for standard intelligence purposes, understanding the enemy, identifying leaders, tracking movements. And then, 8 months ago, she'd been copied on a communication she was not supposed to see, an administrative error so complete it was almost beautiful in its incompetence. And what the communication said was that the data was intended for a different purpose. Not intelligence, a weapon. Not a bomb, she said carefully, not a kinetic weapon. The research group that requested the data, I looked them up after. They work on directed resonance technology, focused sound and frequency applications. She looked at him. If you have a complete neural stress map of a species, and you have the technology to broadcast resonance frequencies at targeted biological subjects, you can push them into specific stress states remotely, Cale said. Or all of them simultaneously, she said it quietly. 11 months of data, every stress resonance signature I've mapped, every Vothorak neural configuration I've cataloged. With the right broadcast array, you could. She stopped. Cale sat with it. How many? He asked. The occupation force in the northeast sector alone. She shook her head. 40,000 individual Vothorak. If the broadcast range is wide enough, if the data's good enough. It's good enough, he said. He'd seen her methodology in the facility records. It was extraordinary. Who's the research group? She gave him a name. It was a human name, a human organization, one of the splinter resistance factions that had broken from the main body 8 months ago over a strategic disagreement that everyone in the intelligence community had been politely not talking about for most of that time. The Fulcrum Group. They operated out of what used to be New Jersey. Cale thought about 40,000 Vothorak suddenly and simultaneously pushed into peak neural stress states. He thought about what happened to a mind under that kind of assault. Human, Vothorak, anything, it didn't matter. You couldn't do that without consequence. You couldn't do that and call it a liberation. He thought about the old man under the awning, waiting for the world to come back. They'll use it, he said. They were going to use it in 4 days, she said. That's why I moved when I did. That's why She stopped. The missing researchers, the ones who were inside when the facility went dark. I need you to know I didn't. I left them a way out. I left the maintenance door. I left enough of a window. They made it, he said. It wasn't entirely true. 2 were confirmed dead, not from anything she'd done, from the facility's own security lockdown protocol triggering before they could reach the exit. But 3 had made it, and she'd given them the chance, and that distinction mattered. He watched her absorb it. They made it. She closed her eyes. He gave her a moment. I need the data back, he said, and I need you to help me get into the Fulcrum broadcast facility. She opened her eyes. You know where it is? I know what state it's in. He pulled out his notebook and drew a rough map from memory, the Geographica intelligence from the last 3 months of resistance intercepts assembled into something approximately useful. I know the broadcast array requires a fixed high-point installation, former broadcast tower, most likely. There are 4 candidate structures within range of the occupation's primary garrison. He pointed. Given wind patterns, structural requirements, and the fact that someone needs to get equipment in without Votharak inspection, it's this one. She looked at the map for a long time. You're probably right, she said. Probably isn't good enough. You're right, she said. They left an hour before dawn, moving through streets that had the specific silence of a city holding its breath. Orin Setha moved well for a scientist. She'd learned, the way everyone had learned, the vocabulary of moving through occupied space, the grammar of keeping yourself invisible. She had the device with her, the one she'd been working on when he'd found her, which she'd explained on the way. A resonance disruptor, narrowband, built from components she'd salvaged and assembled over 3 weeks of nights in the library building. It wouldn't stop a broadcast, but it would introduce enough interference into the data stream to corrupt the targeting resolution. Meaning what? He'd asked. Meaning, instead of precise neural stress triggering of specific Votharic individuals, you'd get a broadband pulse of low-grade frequency noise. Uncomfortable. Disorienting. Nobody's neural clusters get pushed to breaking point. 40,000 headaches instead of 40,000 breakdowns, he said. Roughly, that's not a solution. No, she said. But it buys time. He thought about this. Then he thought about the thing he hadn't said yet, the thing he'd been sitting with since she'd explained the weapon, since he'd run the numbers quietly in his head, the way he always ran numbers, patient and relentless, the way you do something you don't want to have to do, but that needs doing. He thought about what a complete neural stress resonance dataset was worth to the resistance, not as a weapon, but as intelligence, as a map, as a way of understanding, finally, after 7 years of occupation, what the Votharak were actually afraid of, what disrupted them, what they couldn't handle, not to hurt them, to outmaneuver them, not 40,000 people in agony. One conversation. He thought about the old man waiting under the awning, the woman with the cart, the teenagers in mismatched rain gear, all the people running libraries and black market pharmacies and food distribution points, doing the quiet daily work of not being erased. He thought about what it would mean to have an edge that didn't require anyone to become monstrous. I'm going to need the data, he said. Not to destroy it, not to hand it to the Fulcrum Group. I'm going to need it to do something specific with it, and I'm going to need your help to understand it well enough to do that thing. She looked at him sideways. What thing? I'll tell you when I'm sure it'll work. I hate that answer. I know. The broadcast tower was the 3rd candidate on his list, not the 1st, which cost them 40 minutes and a tense exchange with a Votharak patrol that he talked them through by the simple method of walking toward the patrol with his prosthetic hand visible and his credentials out, and an air of bureaucratic inconvenience, speaking in the clipped transactional Votharak pidgin he'd spent 2 years learning, invoking a maintenance inspection order that didn't exist. The Votharak had a very specific institutional vulnerability to paperwork. Not stupidity, they were not stupid, not even close, but a cultural tendency to defer to the appearance of administrative legitimacy, which KL had been exploiting for most of his career. The patrol waved them through with the particular combination of boredom and mild annoyance that passed for efficiency in an occupation bureaucracy running on its 3rd year with no end in sight. Inside the tower base, the Fulcrum team was 3 people and a lot of equipment. They had not expected anyone, and for a few seconds the tableau had the specific quality of mutual surprise. Everyone frozen, everyone running the same calculation. Then the largest of the 3 reached for something at his belt, and Kale's prosthetic arm moved faster than any human arm could move and caught his wrist, and the calculation resolved. Sit, said Kale, with the same voice he'd used on the Votharak patrol, which was the voice of someone for whom this is a manageable administrative matter, and everyone should stop being dramatic. They sat. He'd been on the other side of this once, years ago, in a different city and a different context, a moment where someone had him cold, and he'd watched them make a choice about what to do next, and he'd never forgotten the specific quality of attention in that moment, the way time stretched. He tried to remember how he'd wanted to be talked to then. He tried to use that now. I'm not here to shut you down, he said. I'm here because what you're planning to do isn't going to work the way you think it will. And if it doesn't work the way you think it will, a lot of people are going to get killed in the response. Votharak response protocol for a mass casualty event in the occupation zone is documented. It is not subtle. The leader of the 3, a woman younger than he'd expected, with the particular haggard intensity of someone who'd been running on ideology and insufficient sleep for about 18 months, looked at him with something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite despair. It was the face of someone who has decided that the only tool left is the worst one. He knew that face. He'd worn it. "Tell me another way," she said. So he did. Not quickly. It took the better part of 2 hours. Oren Sethe adding technical detail while Kale talked through the strategic architecture. The way you could use the resonance data not as a trigger but as a key. Not to cause mass suffering but to identify specific Votharak command nodes. To understand their stress responses well enough to design negotiations, confrontations, interventions that pushed them toward the decisions you needed them to make. Not manipulation in the crude sense. Strategy. The kind of deep adversarial knowledge that militaries and diplomats had always tried to gather and had never had this precisely. "You're talking about a long game," the younger woman said. "I'm talking about not losing," he said, "which is different from winning, and it's different from what you were about to do, which is losing slowly after a very big noise." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the tower's upper windows, the first gray light of a New York morning was coming in. The specific color of the city under occupation, slate and amber. The old towers still there, still recognizable, still somehow defiant in the way that structures are defiant by simple persistence. Kale looked at the light and thought about Lena, and this time he let himself think about her, not around her. She'd been a cartographer. She'd made maps. She used to say that a map wasn't a description of what a place was. It was a description of how to move through it. That the whole point was motion. He thought that was probably the right way to think about intelligence work, too. About what you did with what you knew. "All right," said the younger woman. She sounded exhausted and very young and not entirely convinced. And that was fine. Conviction came from evidence, and evidence was what they were going to build. "All right, show me what you mean." Oren Sethi sat down at the equipment array and began to work. Kale stood by the window and watched the city come into its gray morning light and smoked the last cigarette in the pack he'd been carrying since the night before, and did not light it from the coal of any previous cigarette because Lena wasn't here to give him grief about that anymore. And he was going to stop performing that grief and start doing something more useful with the specific raw material of still being alive. The prosthetic hand rested against the window frame, its sensors reading air temperature and structural resonance and all the electromagnetic chatter of a city under occupation, all the signals that move through the air and the walls and the wiring, the whole invisible hum of a world still running, still generating, still refusing to go dark. He thought about 40,000 Votharak in a garrison not 4 kilometers from here, running their patrols, filing their reports, deferring to the appearance of legitimate paperwork, cold in their carapaces in the November rain. He thought about the fact that they had stress responses, neural clusters that could be overwhelmed, individual resonance signatures as specific as fingerprints. They were not invulnerable. Nothing that had a nervous system was invulnerable. You didn't need to destroy them. You needed to know them well enough that you didn't have to. 3 weeks later, in a parking garage on the west side of what used to be the financial district, KL handed Director Vasht. She was still wearing the sunglasses, still had that particular quality of exhaustion, though he thought maybe it was slightly less pronounced. A data package that represented 4 days of work by Oren Seth, the Fulcrum Group's resonance engineer, and 2 other researchers who'd been brought in from the eastern sector. "What is this?" Vasht said. It wasn't a question. The start of a conversation, he said. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said, in the tone of someone who had long since used up their capacity for surprise, "You're serious." The Voth Arak Leadership Council has a cluster of individuals whose stress resonance signatures spike specifically in response to what their cultural structure categorizes as strategic overextension. That's documented on page 4, he pointed. Page 7 maps the communication hierarchy. Who reports to whom in the garrison command, and which individuals are operating at what stress levels right now. We know which of their commanders is under pressure. We know which decisions they're making from a position of confidence, and which ones they're making because they're scared. Vasht was reading. You use this, he said, not to hurt anyone, to negotiate, to apply pressure at the right points, to understand which moves they'll resist and which ones they'll accept, because their own command structure is pushing them toward acceptance. She turned a page. Outside, somewhere in the city, something that might have been thunder rolled across the sky. though the weather had been clear for days, and Kale decided it was probably a Voth-Eric atmospheric processor cycling through its maintenance routine, which was a thing they did every few weeks, and which always sounded like the world ending, but was merely infrastructure. He had learned to tell the difference. "I'm going to need Cethe," Vesh said. "She's already agreed," he said. "She has conditions." "Of course she has conditions, reasonable ones." Vesh looked up. Behind the sunglasses, he had the sense of being evaluated by someone who had been evaluating people for a very long time and was extremely tired of finding them wanting. He held still and let her look. "Reasonable," she said. "The data doesn't get weaponized," he said. "That's the non-negotiable. She'll work with you, she'll extend the research, she'll help you build the negotiation framework. But the moment it shifts from strategic intelligence to mass application frequency weapons, she walks and takes the key data with her. That's the condition." Vashti was quiet for a long time. "You understand," she said, "that there are people in the Resistance Command who are going to want the other option." "Yes." "People with resources and motivation and a very short timeline." "Yes." "And you're asking me to hold that line." "I'm asking you to look at page 12, he said. "The long-term strategic modeling section." Oren ran the probability architecture on both scenarios. The mass application scenario has a 43% chance of successful tactical disruption of the garrison and a 91% chance of triggering a response protocol that kills between 12 and 40,000 civilians in the sector within 72 hours. The intelligence application scenario has a 31% chance of meaningful strategic advancement in the next 6 months, rising to 68% over 2 years with a civilian casualty projection 3 orders of magnitude lower. He paused. "We spent 7 years asking them to be afraid of us," he said. "I'm suggesting we try something else." Vash took the data package. She tucked it inside her jacket. She took off her sunglasses for the first time since he'd met her, and he found that she had very ordinary eyes, the kind of eyes you'd see on anyone, anywhere, tired and clear, and containing the specific weight of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and was not sure yet whether she'd been given permission to put it down. "Get some sleep, Brecht," she said. He walked back through the sector as the afternoon light shifted, gold under cloud cover. The buildings casting long shadows across streets where people moved with slightly more confidence than they'd had last week, which might have been his imagination, but which he chose to read as real. A woman with a cart, teenagers. The old man under the awning, this time actually reading a book. A physical book from the informal library 2 blocks over, which seemed like progress of a particular and inarguable kind. Cale nodded to him as he passed. The old man looked up. He nodded back. The prosthetic hand was warm from the afternoon sun, the sensors reading the specific electromagnetic signature of a city that had not yet given up, all its hidden signals still transmitting, still threading through the air between buildings and people and the long gray sky. He flexed the fingers. He thought about Lena's maps. He thought about how you move through a place you don't yet understand, the incremental work of building knowledge into navigation, of turning the unknown into the merely difficult. He pulled out his notebook. Under the last entry, "knows what they're looking for," he wrote one more line. "So do we." He put the notebook away and kept walking, the city carrying its ordinary weight around him, persisting in the particular human fashion, which is to say stubbornly, impractically, and with absolutely no intention of stopping.